Welcome to AI Home Podcast, the first podcast for real estate resources and independent living strategies for the disability community. Why? Because accessibility is home. Hi, I'm Angela Fox, blogger, author, and your host. Now, let's begin. I appreciate everybody joining me today on Accessibility is Home, and I am sitting in my accessible bathroom because we know here at Accessibility is Home that accessibility in housing goes beyond the bathroom. I have a wonderful guest, Jonathan. Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan, he, him pronouns. I work for the Department of Labor on disability employment policy, but I'm here in my personal capacity outside of work to talk about some of the work I've done on accessibility and disability in the kitchen, discussing some work on accessible bathrooms and support for people living with dementia and other age-related memory disabilities. A bit about me, I'm autistic and I have OCD, so I am a person with more than one disability. I live here in Greater Washington with my partner, David. I have degrees from the University of Chicago, Oxford University, and University of Maryland. And at Maryland, I did focus on age and disability in community planning. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about accessibility. I actually read Angela's awesome book, My Blue Front Door, when I was doing some research on accessible housing. It's a great book. You should get it. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on her podcast, but it's also been helpful for me as I go about my own housing search.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And we had actually connected through a mutual friend, Edith, I recorded. It's in a previous episode, so go check that out.
That's awesome.
He is. He's absolutely awesome. And I was able to interview him. Edith has some wonderful things with regards to permits and Fair Housing Act. So please check out that episode. But when I was interviewing him, he mentioned, hey, you got to interview Jonathan. He's a really good resource for a lot of accessibility for kitchens and things like that. I always like to share how I find some of my guests because the disability community is not just diverse, but also a small, connected community. And so I always like to shine that out whenever I can.
Absolutely. And something I often point out to my friends who are wondering, for example, why I'm much more careful about what I post on Facebook or Twitter, which I'm refusing to call by its new name.
Amen.
It's not only is accessibility and disability a small community, it's we all know each other's business. So the smallness can be sometimes like, oh my gosh, you never know who's reading something. But it's also really great because if you want to know something, there's nothing like sending out that bat signal in the accessibility community, because even when it's not related to accessibility, if you don't know it, someone either knows or will know someone who knows.
Yes. So the moral of the story is you don't need to reinvent the wheel, which is part of the reason why I started this podcast for disability home ownership. And there's a lot of people who are the able-bodied community, not part of the disability community. When they're facing with the disability issues, they somehow feel that they need to just come up with the answers themselves, or the answers are not out there, and so it can't be done. And that bat signal, I totally agree. In fact, that's how I found Edith. I posted a thing on one of the Facebook groups, and I said, I need a guest for this, and boom, Edith was there, a whole bunch. The bat signal is definitely, it may take 2 or 3 weeks, but it certainly does work out. So please don't reinvent the wheel.
And that's actually a really good segue into a project that we're recording this in September, but it's going to be posted in November. But in this this August, I actually released, so I already had one food blog called Flavors of Diaspora, which is started out as mostly a Jewish food history food blog. But as I became more, okay with both my disability identity, but also my professional pursuits in accessibility, it started talking more and more about disability in the kitchen. And something I realized is that there isn't a lot of good stuff out there for neurodivergent people and food safety. So neurodivergence, level setting, it's a series of cognitive disabilities that affect some way how the brain works. So you have the ones that people traditionally think of, autism, ADHD, but things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is with numbers, OCD, traumatic brain injury, dementia, other cognitive disabilities. And a lot of the food safety resources out there, I realized, aren't really great for neurodivergent people. And so I set about creating this resource, which I released in August, called Safe and Neurospicy, which will be linked in the show notes.
Oh.
And it's targeted food safety information for neurodivergent people. And it's a continual work in progress. Obviously, folks send feedback, send input. I'm constantly improving on it. But one thing I really try to focus on was not reinventing the wheel, because there are a lot of good resources about individual topics out there. And why reinvent the wheel, especially with something as important as food safety, when you can really direct folks to resources that talk about things like, let's take chopping, for example, how to use a knife, how to select a knife, how to use a knife if you're blind, how to use a knife if you have limited hand motion. If using a knife is not a good idea for you, or if you don't have the spoons, food safety tips on those pre-chopped vegetables, which are a big accessibility thing. And even though while it seems, oh, I'm inventing something, it's really actually more a lot of what it was creating filler language, creating filler things, but also compiling the wheels into this one bigger machine. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that oftentimes it's not as much, does this thing not exist, but the wheels haven't been properly aligned.
Yeah, and they haven't been framed in such a way that it's easily identified. These are the things that you could pull together to get what you need. And that's funny. The reason why I'm so excited about you talking about that and kitchen accessibility is not just for this episode, but every episode I've started, at least video, which has just been going on for a few months. I have an audio one that I've been doing for the last 2 years, everybody. So check it out on Apple and Spotify. But the video is, I always say, I'm sitting in my bathroom because accessibility housing goes beyond the bathroom. And I say that for a reason, because when you're dealing with accessibility, usually it's just focused on the bathroom. And a lot of that is ableism, because this idea that somebody is going to what? Chop up those vegetables or going to cook for you. And so you really are not going to be a chef yourself. And so why bother making sure that the kitchen is accessible, let alone getting into the weeds of what you're just saying of for recipes and things of, can you chop that up for a particular reason? It just really does highlight, if you're listening and you don't think about those things, it might be because of that, what we call ableism, this idea that someone else is going to be cooking for you.
And beyond that, there's a lot in there. It's like assuming that the person with the disabled person even has someone else who can cook for them. There's class and also all sorts of weird gender things in there. And then on top of it goes on top of two other things. One is that kitchens, generally speaking, are not well designed already in the US, even for abled people. It's a lot of times women still do the majority of cooking in the United States because patriarchy and because of how we divide labor in this country, and men are not always taught how to cook. And then on top of which, it's often men designing kitchens, but without that cooking knowledge. So you end up, even for someone who is abled, it shows that I have to think a little bit harder to think of an abled person in my life, because I know a lot of disabled people and have a lot of disabled relatives. But I'm thinking about a cousin of mine who's abled, and even she pointed out to me that, wow, this sink makes absolutely no sense because I can't fit a pot in it. And I'm just like, what a fail. What a design fail. And then on top of which, we also something I learned when I was doing this neurodivergent food safety site is we're actually really bad at teaching food safety in the United States. I learned a lot of new things while doing research for that site, particularly all of the different ways that basic foods, if you don't store them right, can make you sick. For example, it's extremely important to refrigerate cooked rice, because cooked rice is the perfect vehicle for this particular bacteria to grow that can make you really sick. And I was putting rice in the fridge anyway, but I didn't realize, wow, okay, this is something that if you take it to work, you need to really put it in the fridge from your lunchbox kind of level. And then on top of which, the built-in ableism that's in the kitchen goes on top of this. And then the resources that are out there aren't necessarily disability minded. So one, for example, is that when you look at a lot of stuff from meat, they're only giving you visual cues as to say, how do you know the meat is bad? Okay, but if you're blind or low vision, or many neurodivergent people have trouble processing colors, you're not going to necessarily be able to do that. So having other sensory cues, it might feel slimy. There might be an acrid smell. Those are other ways. And I think that's something there, is that this ableism always intersects with other messiness generally.
And we don't even teach like how many days after the expiration date, which the expiration date is just the date when it's the most freshest, not when it technically goes bad, because you're expected to be able to purchase whatever item that is from the grocery store and then take it home and wait for so many days. But we don't even teach that for a lot of products. And then can you read that? Can people who have visual impairments or who are blind, the date is not even there? And that is another level of ableism, is that even with the date and you know how many days afterwards, what are you going to do if you can't read it? You literally can't read it.
Exactly. And it's also the question of design, is that a lot of times the data is, say, printed on right on top of the ingredients list. It's not just impossible for someone who has a vision disability to read. It's just difficult to read for anyone. And then also it's that it's also not a hard and fast rule. I have a table in Safe and Neurospicy of how long after the date for unopened and opened goods you can do.
I'll download it now.
Took quite a bit of time to research, because it's actually quite finicky, because it's even for different dairy products, it'll actually vary according to the product, because some of it's biology. For example, yogurt has to keep it safe for longer than just milk, and then butter is a whole other thing. Butter is a wonder food for multiple levels, and one of it is that it stays good for a lot longer than people realize. And then I think another thing that this then happens is that for folks who have chronic illnesses, folks who have limited spoons, our shout out to the spoonies out there. I'm not a spoonie, but know and love lots of spoonies. If it's going to take, if you have to then go and get a new ingredient, that can use up the spoons that you have for cooking for that day or for those 2 days. And having that knowledge, hey, you can actually still use this thing. That's actually the difference between someone being able to cook something that they want and someone either not being able to cook or not being able to cook something that they want. And even if nourished, it's not as good of an experience. And I think in tandem with, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but there are a bunch of new cookbooks out there by disabled folks for disabled folks. I think it's also important to have these sort of really thinking about the methods while also recognizing that the institutional ableism intersects with all sorts of other things that are wrong with the way we're approaching and thinking about food.
Yeah, and we could go off ableism and till the cow comes home. I'm originally a Midwestern. But as far as like the design of a kitchen, what are some things that you have seen that are failures, and what would you recommend to rectify that?
I'll go through 3 failures and then ways that I've seen it rectified.
Okay.
They're pretty common. And my first one is that I disagree with a lot of other food folks who kind of claim that, gas is the great new thing. Firstly, gas is not new, but secondly, gas is actually it's not even that great for cooking, but the thing is, it's really dangerous for a lot of folks with disabilities because the burn risk is so high, and especially for people with cognitive disabilities, with any disability that affects memory, there's a very high fire risk. And then also it's very easy for a lot of blind and low vision people to burn themselves. It's also much trickier for many folks who use wheelchairs or mobility devices to safely navigate with. So electric can be good if there are some well-designed stoves out there. But one thing that's really exciting is that induction is getting cheaper. And induction, besides being really good for cooking, has a lot of safety features that make it a lot safer for many people with disabilities. There's less burn risk if you're using a mobility device, especially if it's such that your face is much closer to the flame, or much closer in this case to the heat source. Because it's magnetic, the burner turns off when the pan's removed. So it's also much safer for someone who's blind or low vision if they're having to feel around where something is. And if someone, say, living with dementia, or if they have ADHD and they forgot to turn the stove off, there's that safety feature. And also, if there's a spill, it's also much less likely to be a fire. So I think the growth of induction and also improved electric models, that's been really good. The second thing I think is also really one thing I've seen with a lot of fridges, and there's a whole discourse from an environmental perspective about how fridges in the US are also just too big for environmental reasons, but a lot of fridges are really narrow, deep.
Oh, say that again. You say that again for me.
A lot of fridges are way too deep. And it's, okay, I am 6'2", and my disabilities don't affect my mobility. I have long arms, and I have issues sometimes. So it's like someone who's using a mobility device, or someone who is of short stature.
I don't even use the top shelf of my refrigerator,
Yeah.
and my electric wheelchair raises to the highest you can get. And I don't bother to use the top shelf because if the item gets pushed back, I got to get someone to get it out. And go ahead, I'm sorry, but it's just such a pain.
Exactly. It's so easy to forget about food in there. It's actually easy to hurt yourself getting something from the fridge. On top of which, it's even beyond these risks, it's just a nasty user experience. And so one thing that's been exciting, and I've been seeing this when we've been doing home viewings, is that there's actually been a lot more variation now in fridge design. Mm-hmm. And now it is still a bit expensive and it's going down, but I think you're seeing both a lot more smaller fridges, a lot of fridges that are shallower and lower, and it makes it easier for so many things to reach in, to keep track of what you're doing, to know what you have, to perceive what you have and I think that's really exciting. I think that came to freezers before fridges. Why that was, I don't know, but I think that's really exciting. And again, the benefits go beyond accessibility. It's a quote unquote curb cut effect, is that it's also going to make it easier to not waste food.
Now, do you know if sorry, you hit home, but if the smaller, are they by any chance getting wider? Because if I'm thinking if a shelf is more shallower, I really, and this is just for cabinetry in general, I rather have something that's wider and shallower because then I can reach everything versus what you traditionally say is as tall as the sky can go and then super deep and narrow.
Yes, I have seen them. I can't think of a model off the top of my head, but I have seen that, which I think is really good. And what's advantageous also, if it's wider, again, from a neurodiversity perspective, is that if there's someone who has trouble, if it's an access barrier for them to keep track of things, it's going to be easier when they open the fridge to see everything in front of them. Yeah. This is actually something we encounter at home because I have autistic memory, which means I remember way too much stuff, but my partner, who's not autistic, he'll sometimes forget about things in the fridge because he doesn't see them. And because I'm a bit of an avid home cook, I've got a lot of like weird specialty ingredients and sauces and things in there. And then he'll be like, "Oh, I forgot about this sliced cheese." And I'm like, "It's not, but it's yours." I don't tend to eat that many. I like sliced cheese. I just don't tend to eat it that often. So it's generally his. But an organization like that would benefit him, not from an accessibility perspective, but because on top of accessibility, there's just all of these different quirks that people have.
And you have smart refrigerators too now. And I've seen one where you can enter in what you put in and they'll keep track of it. It's super expensive, but I thought, wow, that's something I really need. Now, of course, you got to enter in the stuff. It's not that you just put the stuff in. And I was looking at it, I'm like, I'm wondering from a visual perspective, if you are visually impaired, how well that platform was accessible. It's supposed to be able to talk out, but the demo didn't provide that. So it could be just fix one issue and not the other. But hopefully, to go back what you're saying that the refrigerators are expanding. It's another example. I hope that gets more technology friendly for everybody because I would love my refrigerator to tell me what I have in there. I would love it. And now a quick break from our sponsor. So as you can see and also hearing me, I am sitting on my back deck and I have my grill. I love being out in my back deck. I hate when I forget something and I have to wheel back into the house, particularly my cell phone. However, I'm excited to announce that another disabled-owned business, Cush Pocket has come up with a solution by creating this fabulous wheelchair bag. I love this bag and have been a proud customer since almost the very beginning. Why do I like it? One, it's huge. Two, it comes in multiple colors. But three, you can put it anywhere on the base of your wheelchair. How does that happen? It's attached to the flap and it has little Velcro. You put it directly underneath your cushion of your wheelchair. And the Velcro and the weight of your body ensures that this fabulous Cush Pocket bag certainly will not move. I personally have two directly in front of me and it hides behind my legs. And I love that because it's so much more convenient. Trust me, you will never forget anything ever again. So as you can see down below, I have a direct link for Cush Pocket. And if you use my code Angela Fox, you will get $1 off. And not only will you get a fabulous bag, but you'll also support two disabled-owned businesses, Cush Pocket and my business, Horizontal Houses. Check it out.
Yes. And I've only seen news articles and things about these smart fridges. I haven't actually seen one in, can you say in the flesh, in the iron,
Right.
in the metal for a refrigerator? Yeah. And I think this is where it comes to thing number 3 is that a lot of kitchens are really badly ventilated. And this is a big issue. This is actually a big issue just from a safety perspective generally, is that you get a lot of smoke buildup. It can get very dangerously hot. But it's especially important for people who are neurodivergent or have migraine disorders where it can get very sensorily overwhelming. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been there is now more attention to ventilation than there was before. And what I'm hoping is that's also actually going to then carry over into as kitchens are designed, because you right now have ventilation over the stove, but really thinking about how there needs to be a lot more ventilation in kitchens and it needs to be, and it also needs to be tied in with air purifying, because that has a big impact both on the food you cook and on the sensory experience of cooking. And I think that's going to be important. And then I think there are a lot of things that go beyond house design that have gotten better in recent years. Pre-chopped vegetables are really important for people because a lot of people shame them. And I'll admit, as I was coming into my own disability identity, I used to shame them, but I realized they're actually really important, not just for people who can't chop or don't have the spoons to chop or who for mental health reasons don't want to have a knife around, but it's just such a time saver. Chopping can be forever. I also learned in reading about this that in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, you could actually buy pre-chopped vegetables at many of the markets in Aztec and Maya cities. And the Spanish, when they arrived, in one of their accounts was like, wow, this is so cool. You can buy this. They were calling it a gourd because they were just learning what squash is. You can buy these gourds and these things that are already chopped for you. We've been literally having this for hundreds of years. And I think there's been more acceptance now, especially in the past few years, of these ingredients. And also recognizing that these, when they're pre-chopped, it's not a bad thing, but because they're pre-chopped, they do have some different properties because they've been chopped. And more recognizing you're going to want to think about that when you cook. There's a new book out that I haven't read yet, but I've skimmed, called Crip Up the Kitchen by Joel Sherrod. And he does talk about using pre-chopped vegetables. And I'm hoping that goes beyond the disability community into just everyone. Because if you're a mom with a small kid, those things are great. And there are lots of these accessibility things that I think are getting just more accepted now, which is really important.
I totally agree. I love things that are pre-chopped, especially for me, just to give like a real life example, is I have a short stature. And so even if I have countertops in my kitchen that are lower, I'm not really above as much as someone else would be standing. And I can't get any higher because my knees will bump into the counter space. Like for like a big old squash, I love to grill, but I need that chopped up. And I buy that now chopped up at Whole Foods. To me, that goes from I will only do it once or twice a year because it's such a pita for me to chop it because I know
Exactly.
I don't have the angle and even the dexterity a little bit. And versus, I could now buy that pre-chopped. I've integrated that particular vegetable into my diet more frequently And luckily, it is a little bit more expensive, but a lot of things are give and take. I just, guess what? I will buy a particular suite. And at the end, that's better for me, right? I'm good about trade-offs. But I love how you brought it back to Aztec, because I'm always about the history of disability, because we have a tendency to think that history disability
Exactly.
is something that's just occurred in the last 50, maybe if you're going the Revolutionary War, 200 years. But most people think it's more of a 50 to 80-year time span, right? And it's not. And if you all listen, I have a wonderful guest. She's an international traveler, and it's for International Disability Day in December. And I talk about accessible housing and how far back the concept of a ramp has gone. And I won't spoil it because I want everybody on December 5th. I think December 5th is International Disability Day, and you can listen to it towards the very end of the podcast. But I love it that you brought that up, that this accessible feature, in fact, has gone back that far, because disabilities and convenience has always been part of human nature. Doesn't matter what civilization you're talking about. So I love that you brought that up.
Exactly. And I'll actually use that as a transition to bathrooms. But just before I do that, just another couple of things is that there are a couple of resources I'll put in the show notes. One is about actually cleaning, which is a huge part of kitchen safety. And there's a website around cleaning for neurodivergent people called, pardon my language, Unfuck Your Habitat. I will put that in. And then there's actually a new cookbook out by a neurodivergent author and autistic chef named Matthew Broberg Moffat called Color, Taste, Texture, which is for people with food aversions, and a really great interview on accessible kitchen design with Megan Blow. And these are really great resources. But going in with history, I think it's also important because I think we always learn a lot from history. I'm Jewish, and even though there's a lot of ableism in the Jewish community there, we have a tradition going back thousands of years. And it comes from the phrase in the Torah, don't put a stumbling block before the blind, but there is a long tradition of discussing disability. The greatest prophet in Jewish tradition, Moses, is said to have had a speech disability. So for one thing that's really been important in the Jewish disability world is to root it in our history, because even though there's been a lot of ableism in the Jewish community, and there still is, that is something that also goes way back. And it even goes into questions around food. There's aspects of there are exemptions to bans on cooking on the Sabbath, because if you have a disability and you're not able to do something safely with that, there you can do other things. And I think that's something where, knowing that we're building on a big tradition is great. Now, with the international thing, I did a lot of my research in grad school on accessible restrooms, and largely advocacy for accessible public restrooms, because even beyond accessible restrooms, we just don't have enough public restrooms in this country. And it's one of the interesting things that there are a couple of countries that are just absolutely knocking it out of the water with accessible public restrooms. Korea and Australia actually have laws that mandate certain levels of access. And even though Korea's had some issues with the safety of those restrooms, especially those two countries, especially Australia, has done a lot of really interesting stuff. Iceland has done cool things. There's been a lot of efforts in the UK. And I think that's something where, just observing that has been like, okay, what can we learn here? Because disability, we oftentimes talk about it in a very American context, but also in a very Western context. Bidets, really awesome. And one important, and besides the fact that it's much easier for folks to get clean after number 2, with them is that I learned in my research that toilet paper is actually not enough for some people who follow certain schools of Islamic thought or certain schools of Hinduism. So this is about a matter of religious inclusion as well. And I think this is something where it's people get squeamish about the bathroom. And it's very much, just as you were saying, just like with the kitchen, it's like the international perspective is really helpful. And mind you, I could talk about bathrooms all day.
It is such a big issue for the disability community. I'll admit, the whole idea of me having my video podcast in a bathroom did not come on my own. There's another great podcast that's just audio, and it's called Accessible Stall. I love it. I want to give a shout out. It's on Apple and a few other, and it's 2 individuals who have CP. They've been best friends. It's a guy and a girl, and they talk about all kinds of disability stuff, but it has nothing to do with handicap bathrooms. In fact, they did it for a couple of years, and they're like, hey, we might want to do an episode about accessible stalls going out and things like that. But as a person who's in a wheelchair myself, when I saw that and realized that it had nothing to do with accessible stalls, I still got that because that's part of our culture, and that has really been the gateway outside of ramps, outside of like sidewalk ramps. Sidewalk ramps and accessible bathrooms have been the gateway for accessibility and integration into the community. And so that's why you can certainly talk about that. But when you would talk about accessible bathrooms, I think it's great if you want some inspiration. You don't have to look in the United States. Go look at Korea. Go look at a few. Dubai is also really expanding their accessible tourism. There's some really exciting things going.
Japan as well. Japan's done a lot.
As well, yeah. Right? That's another location. But I was researching, and I didn't realize that hotels were really the first ones in America, at least. Hotels in America were the first ones to put wall-mounted toilets. And the reason why they did that had nothing to do with accessibility. It just looked nicer because you don't have a peg underneath the bowl of the toilet. And why that's important is I have a wall-mounted toilet because then my front pedals and my front wheels don't bump the peg of the toilet. That's why handicap bathrooms, whether they're at home, a hotel, or whatnot, are wall-mounted. But I just think that's really important.
What's really cool about wall-mounted toilets as well is that they're also, it's actually easy. It makes the bathroom much easier to clean. And for people with and without disabilities, but especially also if you have a mobility thing, there's a lot, we don't have them here where we live right now. And I can say that there's a lot of weird twists and turns when you're cleaning the bathroom. And what's really, and hotels are really interesting because there's so many different varieties of accessibility when you're traveling. And hotels are interesting in that sometimes they don't do as well. I think the move towards being very flashy has been problematic for neurodivergent travelers, but on the other hand, oftentimes they lead the way with, for example, accessible rooms, for example, really thinking about how can we do this cheaply, because also ultimately it's a business, it's a bottom line, but then that makes it exportable. But it also gets back to a key thing with accessible restrooms is that even restroom availability determines whether or not many people are able to go a place or go out. I'm thinking about folks with digestive disabilities. I know a lot of folks with those where it's like when they go, they really need to go. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be more frequent and more urgent. And then on top of which, someone would say with a urinary continence disorder, which actually happens oftentimes after pregnancy for many folks. Or if you have diabetes and you need to inject insulin, if you have a stoma bag and you need to change the bag, there are a lot of things in which availability of a restroom is going to be important. I think when folks are looking at bathrooms in their own home, the first thing to always remember is that it's your home and you need to do it in a way that works for you.
Yes.
And think about, you're going to spend a lot of time in that bathroom. So think about just getting light bulbs that work for you in there. If you're light sensitive, maybe that fluorescent light that's so frequent in home bathrooms isn't a good idea for you. That's going to be the first thing we get when we have our own place. It's not this bright light mandated by a landlord, but it's those wall-mounted toilets are great. There are cheap bidet attachments that you can get for a toilet, but it's really all of this research also means that you're able to also customize home bathrooms really easily.
Yeah. And that's one thing people ask me, why don't you just do a podcast about accessibility? And that's because the world out there is not accessible. And despite all the wonderful laws and advocacy that we have, and I tell people, but your home should be your oasis away from that. If you're an active listener, I'm sorry you've heard me say this, but you hit it, Jonathan, when you said you could customize. And the reason why you could customize is that if you own a home, meaning it's not subsidized housing, it's not funded by the federal government or state government, which means subsidized housing, and you flat out own it, and it's not a rental property, you could do whatever you want pretty much, because the ADA guidelines only apply for places that are open to the public, like businesses, and the Fair Housing Act only applies to rental property and apartments or condominiums that have 4 units or more. So if you have a single family home, a townhome, and you are the person paying the mortgage, you could do whatever you want. And I always tell that to people, because oftentimes when you get contractors, they are going to automatically think they have to follow the ADA guidelines. And
Exactly.
unless their county or state, in fact, requires for private sector housing to follow these guidelines, you could do whatever you want. And I also caution people, if you're doing contracts, don't necessarily say ADA. You need to say something along that it has to be customized to meet your disability needs, because otherwise they'll go straight to ADA or fair housing HUD requirements, and that may not be appropriate for you. And so it's really important to be mindful. I'm sorry I had to get off that tangent, but so many people feel like they can't do that. And the only thing I have to say, though, whatever you do, please think of that, not just the function of it, but also the cosmetic, because that's really is the difference between something that adds value to your home and makes it more marketable versus something that quote unquote detracts it, because that's also a little bit of an ableism that comes into play. And we've talked about just here about things that have changed that is beneficial to everybody in universal design, but you also have to make it, I hate to say, look pretty. You just do.
And it's good to make it look pretty because it's your home. Make it yours. And I think
don't make it a hospital. Don't be like you're in a hospital, please. No, it's your oasis.
Great. Good. But that's something, it's like, then coming back to the home, it's that there's stuff to do, but it's also, we still have a ways to go, because again, we're not, the way we design bathrooms, it's not just ableist, but also we're not even it doesn't even account for menstruation. It's just, they're not well designed.
With children, like,
it intersects with so many things.
It does. Now, I had done an episodes only audio about wet room concept for a bathroom as an alternative for people who are in wheelchairs, but then have really limited space for the bathroom. And so a wet room is a way of utilizing small space, but that's a mobility type focus. And you mentioned about lighting. Is there anything else in bathroom designs for neurodivergent or people who have dementia that you would like to share with the audience?
I'll use this also then as a seg to the third topic, dementia. But for neurodivergent folks, I think it again goes back to ventilation. Bathrooms do need to have ventilation according to code, because there's a lot of, as we all know, there's a lot of different smells and a lot of mold risk. But it's oftentimes deeply accentuated for many neurodivergent folks. And it's actually, particularly a lot of times in my experience, I don't know if this is a scientific thing, but a lot of neurodivergent people are a lot more sensitive to mold, or can sniff the mold earlier. So it's like ventilating it for 3 times as long, keeping the window open. So just making sure that the ventilation's really as good as it can be. One of the things I was excited about when we moved into this apartment compared to where I was living before is that the ventilation in the bathrooms was so much better, so that I could actually turn off the fan. I had to keep the fan running the whole day after taking a shower in my old place, because otherwise there would be mold, because it's Maryland. The other thing, and then this goes into dementia, is that make sure the faucets are the easiest ones to use. The universal design faucets that are just push faucets that you can use in multiple different ways. And this is for 2 reasons. One is that separate hot and cold faucets, I'll just be frank, those need to die. But secondly, it's much easier to actually make sure it's turned off. Because something that you often see with people living with dementia is that these little things can easily be missed. And if you make it harder to miss the little things, then you won't end up with something like a huge water bill or a flood.
Is that because it's less, like, explain
There's
how.
less to do, and it's easier to see that it's off.
Okay.
And it's obvious, it's more intuitive. Because one of the things with dementia that people don't realize. So let's level set a little bit on dementia. Dementia is a series of disabilities, a series of conditions that involve the progressive loss of memory that is usually age-related. There is a term called childhood dementia that actually refers to a separate set of conditions that's genetic. But this is age-related conditions that have to do with the degeneration of processes that help with memory and executive function in the brain. About 80% of cases of dementia are Alzheimer's, but there are a bunch of other dementias that actually don't get a lot of attention and are oftentimes quite different in their physical aspects and their mental aspects. Dementia is usually progressive, so you have people who have what's called mild cognitive impairment, or the beginning stages of dementia, where they're still able to, say, work and live independently in the community, and then moderately to severe. And there's a lot of different manifestations, but it usually affects the memory. It usually affects how many things, the executive function, how many things can be going on in the brain at one time. And it actually, very importantly, affects the gait. So it affects how people walk and mobility disabilities. The biggest risk for many people living with dementia is falling. And dementia usually occurs after the age of 60, although for some folks, like folks with Down syndrome, it'll actually oftentimes occur much earlier. So that's dementia broadly. And what happens in living spaces is that both memory, did you remember to turn off the stove? Did you remember to turn off the faucet? But also the executive function. Is it easy to be prompted to turn off the stove? Is it easy to be prompted to turn off the faucet? Are there safety checks that don't rely on someone remembering something or seeing a prompt, like that induction stove that turns off or the faucet that might automatically lower? And that's where it really starts coming in with dementia.
Great. And what other things would you recommend within the bathroom?
For bathrooms, and then I'll go into the whole house for dementia, but for bathrooms for people living with dementia, it's really, and especially if you're planning to age in place, dementia is a natural part of human aging. And not everyone gets it, but it's something that everyone should really reckon with the possibility that they might get, is that make sure your surfaces are non-slip. Or that you have some slip resistance to your surfaces. And it can even be something as simple as a bath mat, but really thinking about how things drain, because that is actually the biggest risk for many people living with dementia, is the fall risk. And again, don't have things that don't rely on one cue. For example, if you're putting in a new shower faucet, say, instead of just having the red and the blue for indicating the hot or cold, pick a placard for the faucet that also has H and C. Because some people living with dementia, they lose the ability to process pictures before the ability to process text.
Okay.
And then it's similar things going to the whole house, similar things for the whole house. Really thinking about surfaces. Those single story homes are really great, because the stairs are, even if someone has never had a mobility disability before, the stairs are a really dangerous place for people living with dementia. In the kitchen, again, having easily distinguished surfaces. If you have a white floor, then a black countertop. If you have a black floor, then a white countertop, that kind of thing. And again, we have now more technology that allows us to have induction stoves that turn off, allows us to have smart fridges that beep when they're not closed. But those kind of things are really things that I'm hoping are going to be more common for people living with dementia. 3 results I'll share is that 4, actually, sorry, I'm counting. So I've done a lot of writing both about accessible restrooms in my efforts to get more public restrooms here in the Greater Washington. But I also have done writing both for Greater Washington and the American Planning Association on planning for dementia-friendly cities. And that's really at a 30,000-foot overview about the whole community, about the need for better volunteer transportation, about the need for slip-resistant sidewalks and that kind of thing. But accessible housing is a big thing. And towards accessible housing and planning, there are 2 resources I'm going to recommend. One is the American Association of Retired People does a livability index that also measures the availability of housing, but also has housing recommendations. And while they're largely aimed for older adults and people living with dementia, it's actually really helpful for people with any disability at any age. I have found it helpful as an autistic person. The other thing is there's this amazing Canadian academic named Samantha Bieri, and I'm going to link her professor page on the site. She's the world expert, really, in dementia and planning. And a lot of her work is based in Canada, and she's done a lot of thinking about how do you do design that is dementia friendly. And a lot of what she has found is stuff that really benefits people across the disability spectrum. And those are some of the broad recommendations. And then I think just a reminder is that even if you don't develop dementia, if you're planning to age in place, it's something to prepare for. But also if you're planning to sell your house, we are living in an aging society, and right now our society is over 95% of dementia research is just focused on cures, but we're not actually thinking about, there's not a huge amount of research or efforts to actually think about how do we support people with dementia who are already here and who will continue to be here, to have as high of a quality of life. And when you do that, it's not just, when you make your house dementia friendly, it's not just something that makes it more sellable on a market, but also provides more options to folks who, like all of the others of us with disabilities, haven't had those options always.
And some of the things that you were sharing overlap with other disabilities as well, as far as accommodation. You're talking about the high contrast. That's very helpful for people who, have visual impairments. They may not be blind, and they need that high contrast. Another great resource I like to throw out is Living in Place Institute.
Yes.
I'm actually a Living in Place specialist. I got certified through them. And one thing that I always recommend when I go in homes to do assessments, and living in place is slightly different than aging in place because it focuses on safety for children. Because believe it or not, one of the highest deaths in a home is TVs falling on children.
Yes, and
It's scary. It's absolutely scary. So we focus on children's safety, the disabled, and then aging in place, not just the people who be living in the home, but people who may come and visit. So we're talking family and friends, visitors. So it's a very holistic sort of approach. And when you mentioned about some of those things, I was like, yeah, those are things that I would recommend if I know somebody has a visual impairment. Or I also would recommend a stripe, some kind of pretty stripe along the wall, whether it's a rail or whatever, that's contrast, because if you have vertigo, you need something to focus on, and you're not going to look up and you're not going to look down. And so having that stripe is halfway on the wall, and that helps you to guide you to safety.
And that's something new I learned, because the stripes I'd always thought of in a dementia context is it helps people navigate. It helps people follow the stripe. But today I learned, and I think this also gets to the point, is another point is that as an autistic person, when I've done this research, it's like on dementia, and particularly I've gotten to chat with Samantha Bieri, I've gotten to chat with other people who have a lot more expertise on dementia than I do. Or people who have a lot more expertise on restrooms than I do, is also recognizing the intersections between needs for these other disabilities and needs that I experience as an autistic person, or that I might not experience, but other autistic people do. For example, a lot of people living with dementia are really noise sensitive. And so ambient noise can get very distracting or overstimulating. And so just even the materials the walls are built out of really benefit. And I'm also quite noise and heat sensitive. And that's something that it's just, in that thinking, it's actually made it easier for me to spot public spaces that are more accessible for me. And then similarly with restrooms, is that the ventilation point is that it's actually realizing that it's important for so many other disabilities, not just folks who are autistic, but if you are, many blind folks have a heightened sense of smell, because smell is used as one of the ways of navigating the world. And so it's like a bathroom that is stinky for a non-blind person might sometimes be especially stinking to a blind person. It'll be the same amount of stuff, but it's because they're going to be smelling it more, because sometimes when you lose one sense, the other senses are heightened. And I think that's what I love about doing work on accessibility, is that whether it's in the kitchen with food safety, or with the bathroom, or on dementia access, is that in all of these things, I find that there's always these interconnections between different disabilities, different experiences of the world, and also these solutions not only help more than one people, but the solutions might come from the most unexpected places.
I know, and that's one of the ableist dog whistle is we can't accommodate all disabilities. Therefore, we're only going to do one thing, and not realizing, as we just demonstrated, that you could do this one thing and it does accommodate more than one type of disability. And I always tell realtors, when you're looking to sell a home, you are always going to make it neutral for the most people. But there's always this expectation that once that house is sold, more likely the new owner is going to make it tailor it or change it for them. And I say, so if you have that mindset that you're going to make this house as neutral and as open to everybody, why isn't disability as far as we're going to put these accessibility features because it fits the most spectrum of disability, but knowing there may be somebody within a particular disability that will need something extra, and when they buy the house, they can change it. And when I tell people that, they get that, but it's just you have to point it out that you're already doing that sort of framework. So therefore, disability is no different. Not to mention, it also, with universal design, can accommodate the able-bodied community. And then when you tell them that, I'm like, that usually gets them over the hump.
So another thing, and then I think this is a good way to actually end this, is that I think something to always remember with the accessibility is that you can actually have a lot of fun with it. Is that with the kitchens, it's like you can work on food safety and accessibility in the kitchen and still make it really cool, really stylish, really fun, and sometimes for really cheap. Even things as simple as chore wheels and whiteboards and fans for ventilation. Shout out to Color Taste Texture for actually discussing some neurodivergent friendly, cheap ways to address ventilation with restrooms. I think there's been a lot of attention now into the personalization, but even when you're getting that non-slip mat for a shower, you can get something fun. And then with dementia friendliness, I think there's been a lot of interest in how to improve navigation, how to improve things in public space, but even in your own home, if you know that you've got an older relative living with dementia, you go out and get that fun carpet at Target that you can lay down on the hallway, and that'll actually help that person navigate into your home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you would like to share?
I will send my information will be in the chat. Both of my sites, Flavors of Diaspora, Safe and Neurospicy, also links to my writing for Greater Washington and the American Planning Association. And then just a favor for all the listeners, go out and advocate for intersectionally accessible public restrooms. Really think about the kitchen as you go in and how we can just do kitchen designing better. And then finally, if you want to learn more about how to support people living with dementia in your community, really, I'll put this in the resources as well. Really check out resources by Dementia Friendly America, because you can learn how to be a better ally and friend to your neighbors and loved ones with dementia.
HorizontalHouses.com is the hub for all things related to disability home ownership. You will find my blog, this podcast, my book, and how my consulting services can help real estate agents or housing developers market and tap into the largest minority group, the disability community. Please help me continue this exploration of disability home ownership by connecting through my Facebook page. Remember, sharing our collective experiences will allow us each to lower the kitchen sink but raise the bar for disability home ownership. Thank you.